All right, welcome to the study group. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Derek.
Welcome, Kitty. Welcome, everyone at home. Today, we're going to be talking about Adamson and Ratta. Now, first, Adamson was the firstborn son of Adam and Eve in the first Garden of Eden, as we've shown before in our previous podcasts. Ratta was his partner. She has a quite unique history as well. And when they came together, the legacy of their offspring and cultural influences we're still feeling to these days, whether it be from the Greeks to the Indians to European civilization. We're all benefiting from a lot of this work of what has happened. So let me show you the image that Chuck has put together here of Adamson and Ratta. And you get this idea of the adventure and the strength and fortitude of what it took to start to build civilization, essentially. And now I just kind of want to give a overview of the timeline of some of these events that we're going to be covering later on throughout this podcast.
Okay. So this timeline is kind of a map for what we're going to be covering today. So you can always refer back to it, but it's an overview of where we're going. So as Derek just mentioned, Adamson was actually the firstborn to Adam and Eve. He was their first child, and he was born in the first garden. And we've looked at the location of that in the Mediterranean. But that project defaulted after only about 100 years. And because the garden was about to be attacked by angry tribes in the vicinity, Adam decided to pack up their whole crew and relocate so they could pick up the project at another location. And that's what they did. So they moved to an area in Mesopotamia, and Adamson and all the children went with them, but some decided to leave. So in this third point on the list, Adamson's wife and children leave Urantia, but Adam stays to help his father. So they were given a choice. The progeny of Adam and Eve were given a choice whether to stay or go. So a whole lot of them decided to go, including Adamson's wife and all his kids. So that left him kind of not in a happy place when that happened. Yeah. But they did establish the second garden, and that's where the Bible story picks up, is with the second garden. And in Mesopotamia, a little over 100 years later. But Adamson was not happy there. He helped set it up, he helped his father, with some of the construction, but he decided to leave the second garden to search for Van and Amadon's legendary highland home in the north. So we talked about them a little bit in a previous podcast, but they were before Adam and Eve. They actually helped to build the first garden. So Adamson heard legends about the people of Van and Amadon. So he was very intrigued by this and wanted to try to find them. So after a fairly short time, he leaves the second garden in search of these people, and he finds them, but he also finds Ratta among these people. And she was a beautiful, pure-line Nodite. And we'll talk more about the significance of that when we come to it. But they had many offspring, and among their offspring were the progenitors of the Adamsonites, which is a whole group of people that were highly influential, as Derek was mentioning, and we'll see more about that. And then they were also the progenitors of the secondary midwares. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So they established a second center of civilization in the foothills of the Kopet Dagh. And this was a second civilization based on the Adamic inheritance. So we have the second garden in Mesopotamia, and then Adamson and Ratta established this second center of civilization in the Kopet Dagh. He lives for about 396 years, and then their descendants, over the following 30,000 years, migrated in many different directions, and most significantly into Greece, India, and Europe. So we'll be looking at that as well.
Thanks for that, Chuck. I think it's now warranted that we kind of go into the map and give everybody an idea about where the locations that we're talking about and a refresher.
Right.
So here we're going to go in the globe, and we're going to come into remember we're talking about the first Garden of Eden, and that's here off in the Mediterranean coast, off the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. After that initial default of Adam and Eve, they migrated east into what is present day, might as well say, Baghdad area, in between the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, Adamson came along with them in this migration, but not too long after that, he decided to venture up north to find where Van and Amadon used to have their locations. Van and Amadon were the loyal members in the Planetary Rebellion. So they were kind of holding the mission until Adam and Eve showed up. But there was still a location there. And so as you can see, as I go into the map up here, this area right here where we have Van and Amadon's headquarters, this is the area called Turkmenistan. And it's just east of the Caspian Sea, which is right here, right? And this is northern Iran, southern Turkmenistan. They say that it was in an ancient fertile belt.
Mm-hmm. In the Kopet Dagh.
In the Kopet Dagh region. So this mountain range right here is the Kopet Dagh. And you can start to see some of the highlands and other terrain that's out there. So this Adamson headquarters is just kind of like a guesstimation. Mm-hmm. Same with the Van and Amadon headquarters. But we feel that it's important for you to understand where we're talking about.
Right.
And now as we look just east of just west of the Caspian is Mount Ararat. And if you remember from the last podcast, we talked about Mount Ararat and Lake Van, where there are these groups of people loyal to Van
mm-hmm.
and his leadership. So as we talked about before, when Adamson was a young boy, and Van was at the garden, he was telling him stories about these lands.
Right, exactly.
And that's why Adamson had this curiosity after his wife and children left to start anew and maybe contribute to the cultural upliftment of this planet in his own accord with his own family.
Mm-hmm.
And as we find out, that's exactly what happened.
Right. And the thing about the Kopet Dagh was it was in this highland region where it could be protected, so they were safe from the sort of the more antagonistic races that were in the lowlands. So this was sort of a haven to establish this new center of civilization. All right. So it was a strategic location.
Yeah.
In its selection.
All right.
Should we go forward?
Yeah. Let me read the first quote, shall I?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
So this is background leading up to the story of Adamson and Ratta.
Yeah. We kind of broke this down in 3 parts, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just start off with the background of this stuff. So just like as we talked about earlier about the garden, Adam and Eve arrived on Urantia from the year 1934, 37,848 years ago. So add 89 years to that, and that's how many years ago from today, essentially. Mm-hmm. That's when the first garden was established. A planetary Adam and Eve are, in potential, the full gift of physical grace to the mortal races. The chief business of such an imported pair is to multiply and to uplift the children of time. And we see that culturally, racially, mm-hmm. artistically, a lot of things. And they say, the play and humor of the present day races are largely derived from the Adamic stock. So that's Adam and Eve. The Adamites all had a great appreciation of music as well as a keen sense of humor. Okay. And Adamson, who was an Adamite,
right,
the firstborn son of Adam, Adam's son, was the firstborn of the violet race of Urantia. And that's what the Urantia book determines as the Adamites as violet. They had this violet hue, this violet genetic inheritance.
Mm-hmm. And they refer to them as an imported pair.
Right.
So it's important to understand what the Urantia book refers to as material sons and daughters who are brought to this world as racial uplifters. So the indigenous races of the planet are evolved, but part of the plan is always to bring in racial uplifters, which is what Adam and Eve were, are of origin not on this planet, but they're of a very high racial type. So they have all this capacity for music and humor and just all these wonderful characteristics. And the plan was for them to propagate and their offspring to mate with all the existing races to uplift them to their level. So that was what was supposed to happen.
Supposed to. But unfortunately, it did not work.
It kind of broke down. But we still got some of that.
Right, exactly.
As we'll see. And Adamson was a big part of how that happened. Sort of the recovery from the default. Had kind of 2 parts to it. There was the second garden established by Adam and Eve, and then there was Adamson's project, which was also very significant.
Right. So what you'll see is these parallel centers of influence on the planet that are growing, where you have Adamson and then you have what the Adamites were doing too.
Right. And both of those are progenitors or propagators of both cultural and racial characteristics, high culture and high racial characteristics. They're intended to be shared with everyone on the planet. And, as we'll see, some of that happened, but not all of it.
Right. Okay. Well, second quote here, just talking about on that default. Adam knew that he and Eve had failed. He held an all-night conference with some 1,200 loyal followers. And the next day at noon, these pilgrims went forth from Eden in quest of new homes. And remember, we looked at that map just previously, how we started in the Mediterranean and then we moved east in between the Tigris and Euphrates in modern-day Iraq. The heroism displayed in the leadership of the second garden constitutes one of the amazing and inspiring epics of Urantia's history. So now we're in that second garden, like we talked, in between the Tigris and Euphrates, and now a lot of heroism is being displayed. They produced the third alphabet and otherwise laid the foundation for much that was the forerunner of modern art, science, and literature, and produced a type of architecture that was not excelled in thousands of years. It's pretty significant that we start to see some artifacts now and there's some tangible things that are coming from that culture.
And this was all in the second garden.
Right.
Where they had to start from scratch.
That's what's kind of heroic.
That's what makes it kind of heroic, because the first garden had been prepared for them by Van and Amadon and all of the people that were working with them. But, the default, which we talked a little bit about in the last show, we'll get into more of that later, maybe in another show. But they're talking here about the cultural accomplishments in the second garden that were hugely significant, as you can see from this.
Yeah, and you can start to think they didn't have as many resources as they once did. Right. So they were working with a lot less.
Break bare ground.
Yeah.
They had to build walls.
Sweat.
They had
and
to
toil
protect their
brow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It was harsh.
Okay. All right. Well, let me keep going here. More about, and we're going to get into here now, Adamson and Ratta.
So this is just a kind of a story, but it's romantic, it's fascinating, it's courageous, it's heroic on so many levels. So this is very cinematic almost, if you can imagine what's between the lines in this story.
Yeah, and you might recognize some of these things from historical and mythological representation if you're studied in that type of thing. Okay, so Adamson was among that group of the children of Adam and Eve who elected to remain on earth with their father and mother. Now this eldest son of Adam had often heard from Van and Amadon the story of their highland home in the north, and sometime after the establishment of the second garden, he determined to go in search of this land of his youthful dreams. So we got an image here of him out there searching, right?
Yeah, you can bring that up now if you want.
It's just kind of this idea of just to get an idea of that, here he grew up with these stories and now he was going to go into search of these lands.
So did you bring up?
Yeah.
Yeah. So and they had Fandors then.
Yeah.
Which was, they went extinct about 30,000 BC, I think. So they were still available. So this searching, he was actually able to do some of this from the air, which is fascinating to consider.
And that's just a teaser, but Adamson was 120 years old at this time and had been the father of 32 pure line children of the first garden. So 32 pure line Adamites, but they all left.
You're right.
As did his partner. He wanted to remain with his parents and assist them in upbuilding the second garden, but he was greatly disturbed by the loss of his mate and their children, who had all elected to go to Urantia, along with those other Adamic children who chose to become wards of the Most Highs. Adamson did much to forward the early activities of defense and construction, but decided to leave for the north at the earliest opportunity. So he was ready to get out of there.
So when they talk about, elected to go to Urantia, I mean, what they're saying here between the lines is that not only Adam and Eve, but their first line progeny were essentially superhuman. They were not evolved. They were not an evolved race. They were an imported race. So that's why they were given the option to leave after the default. And many of them did. But Adam stayed true to his parents. He was loyal to his parents and decided to stay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let me read this next one here. The northernmost Nodites were descendants of those who had forsaken the leadership of Nod and his successors for that of Van and Amadon. So when we were in the map, let me just kind of throw us back to the map real quick. In here, pull out and show you where we are. Remember the first Garden of Eden and the second Eden. But then remember when we talked about Cain going into the land of Nod, right? When Cain killed Abel and then he left the garden and went into the land of Nod. And we talked about how Nod was the leader of this region. He was why they're called Nodites, right? Mm-hmm. And so these Nodites distributed in different parts of the world. Some north, some central here near the Persian Gulf, and some near Syria and in this western region of the Mediterranean, of the Middle East. So we're talking about now the northern types, these northernmost Nodites.
Yeah, there's a group that went farther north.
Right.
And they were the ones who chose to follow Van and Amadon sometime after the rebellion, which was 200,000 years ago. So Nod was the leader of the offspring.
Yeah, not to get too confusing about all these details,
right?
But we've got, if you look at the map right now, you can see that just north of the second garden, we have Lake Van, Mount Ararat, and then to the northeast is where we had the locations of Van and Amadon, their headquarters. Not far from the land of Nod. And so you do have a lot of Nodites who are moving around in these regions.
And they were an advanced race that dates back to even earlier times. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, yeah.
But they were also quasi-superhuman in their origination, but they blended with the other races and spread out over these large areas. But just to keep in mind that they were a distinct race with high genetic and cultural capacity.
Right, right. So at about 35,000 BC, a company of 27 followed Adamson northward in quest of these people of his childhood fantasies. So he's leading a group of people north into that land. In a little over 3 years, Adamson's party actually found the object of their adventure. And among these people, he discovered a wonderful and beautiful woman, 20 years old, who claimed to be the last pure line descendant of the Princess Staff. So when we talk about the pure line descendants of the Princess Staff, this is those who were part of this Dalmatia region, this first civilization. There was a rebellion, and then some followed the leadership of Nod. And then subsequently, they dispersed in different regions. What we're talking about now are the northern Nodites who have forsaken the leadership of Nod. Mm-hmm. And in there is where Ratta is found.
Right.
And that's where then when Adamson was going up into this region up here in the Kopet Dag region, that's where then he came across and met Ratta in this region. Just so we're clear on that.
And the legacy of Van and Amadon too, his people, because he had established a whole settlement up there.
Right. There were people there who have been there for a long time. Okay. Bear with us with all these quotes.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so now we're going to start talking about Ratta here. This woman, Ratta, said that her ancestors were all descendants of two of the fallen staff of the prince. So we talk about the planetary prince establishing the first civilization in Dalmatia. He had a staff. Two of them were the descendants of, or Ratta's a descendant.
Descendants of those two, pure line descendants.
She was the last of her race, having no living brothers or sisters. She had about decided not to mate, had about made up her mind to die without issue, but she lost her heart to the majestic Adamson. When she heard the story of Eden, how the predictions of Van and Amadon had really come to pass, And as she listened to the recital of the garden default, she was encompassed with but a single thought: to marry this son and heir of Adam. And quickly, the idea grew upon Adamson. In a little more than 3 months, they were married. So you see how, there's this continuation of what she grew up in, of this prophecy.
Uh-huh.
And then now here's the culmination of the prophecy manifesting and showing face to her.
Right.
And so all of the thousands and thousands of years of prophecy actually did hold true.
Yeah, the things she heard about turned out to actually be true. And there's a representative of that showing up on her doorstep.
I know. Okay. So Adamson and Ratta had a family of 67 children. They gave origin to a great line of the world's leadership, but they did something more. It should be remembered that both of these beings were really superhuman. One coming from the planetary princess staff line, one coming from Adam and Eve's line. They're kind of superhuman.
Right.
Every fourth child born to them was of a unique order. It was often invisible. But Adamson well knew of the existence of the primary midwayers. These are unseen beings on the planet that were here long before them. And he concluded that something similar as to this type was transpiring before his eyes. He decided to mate them, and this is the origin of the secondary order of midwayers. So we have primary midwayers and we have secondary midwayers. Primary midwayers coming from the Princess Staff, secondary midwayers coming from Adamson and Ratta's lineage. Within 100 years, before this phenomenon ceased, almost 2,000 were brought into being. So we have almost 2,000 unseen beings, and you can't help but think of some of the mythology that we have on this planet, especially regarding the Greeks and the pantheons of the Olympians and the Titans and things like that, really reflecting this. And we'll get into how Adamsonite culture went directly to Greece and influenced them. So you can start to see a little bit of these stories of the supernatural, but they will start to show up in our mythology and other things like that.
So in the Urantia book scheme of things, there's kind of a chain of being, you might say, that connects the mortal physical beings like us to the higher celestial beings. So sort of between us and the angels are these beings they refer to as midwayers. And there's these two different groups, the primary and the secondary. And the secondary are the closest to us. They're almost like us in many, many ways, but they're not visible to us. And then there's the primary midwayers who are a little less physical, you might say. And then there's the cherubim and the angels and on up from there. But there's a whole chain of celestial being that, is not well known on this planet. I mean, there's stories about angels and that sort of thing. But the midwayers fall into this understanding of the fact that we're not alone on this planet. So the midwayers are very important. We'll maybe do another show on them in particular.
Yeah, I've always wanted to do some kind of graphic design of, seen to unseen personalities and the whole scale of life within that. Maybe there's animal, then there's humans, and then now you're getting to secondary midwayers is the next thing. And that's where it's quasi-material, mostly human kind of. Right. But they're like our cousins.
So we're not alone on this planet. And the secondary midwayers had a lot to do with the creation of the Urantia book. So that's why they're so kind of special to those of us who study the Urantia book, because we give them a lot of credit for the help they've given us.
And in pre-Pentecost, they were responsible for some possessions and demonic.
Yeah, that's true too. The rebellious ones were no party that we want to be part of.
But that's why we're gonna devote a whole podcast on something like that.
Yeah.
So essentially, Adamson and Ratta thus had at their command this core of marvelous helpers, all these secondary midwayers that we were just talking about, who labored with them throughout their long lives to assist in the propagation of advanced truth and in the spread of higher standards of spiritual, intellectual, and physical living, body, mind, and spirit, right? And the result of this effort at world betterment never did become fully eclipsed by subsequent retrogressions. And it says Adamson lived for 396 years. So we're looking at an upliftment of the globe, essentially, of planetary upliftment in these high standards of body, mind, spirit development and living.
Right.
And this is where you start to see why there's such value in some of these teachings of where the influences have spread out. I think the Greeks or like Ayurvedic teachings of ancient India and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You're really going to see some influences that are such foundations of our culture, you don't even question where they came from. But now we're going to try to reveal.
Yeah, the myths and legends and stories from the distant past, they all are kind of echoes of a lot of what we're talking about here. And just for clarification, the Midwayers are undying. So when they talk about the long lives, they're talking about Adamson and Ratta.
Yeah.
The Midwayers are undying. So
they're still here.
They're still here.
Most of them.
Most of them.
All right. Well, you want to go, Chuck?
Okay. So now we're going to get into the legacy of Adamson and Ratta and what they gave to this world and how we can see the outworking of their efforts. So in this first slide, on that, switching gears a little bit, they say that the Adamsonites maintained a high culture. So the Adamsonites being the offspring of the direct line offspring of Adamson and Ratta. They're referred to as Adamsonites. So they were kind of another race unto themselves. They maintained a high culture for almost 7,000 years from the times of Adamson and Ratta. And some of the advances of that age persisted to become the latent part of the cultural potential, which later blossomed into European civilization. So that was one of the directions that their offspring migrated, one of the directions of migration, which created the sort of latent potential that blossomed later. They also say that this center of civilization was situated in the region east of the southern end of the Caspian Sea, near the Kopet Dag, what Derek was showing on the map. And a short way up in the foothills of Turkestan are the vestiges of what was one time the Adamsonite headquarters of the Violet race. So this being the second headquarters, the first being the second garden in Mesopotamia. So here we have this map showing. Now what's interesting about this image showing the Kopet Dag archaeological sites, so all those white dots represent archaeological digs, archaeological sites, but none of this began until about the 1950s or 60s. There was the discovery that there's this treasure of archaeological findings in that region that was not even, people weren't even aware of it until, I mean, there were a couple of digs earlier, but really not until the 1960s and later. So the fact that the Urantia book is telling us that there's vestiges of their civilization in that region is now becoming clear. They're actually finding some of these things. So that's kind of a cool.
Yeah, if the Urantia book this part was written in 1932.
Right.
And they're talking about things that weren't even found out until the 50s or 60s. So
right. So there's a kind of a predictive aspect there.
Mm-hmm.
And then this next slide just shows some of the artifacts that they're finding in these regions.
And these are cool because you can see a high level of metal understanding and intricate detail. It's not just, little carvings or anything. There's
metal
gold
work
in there. There's copper. There's a lot of metal work going on.
And you can see them in the bottom right corner. That's somebody's finger.
That's how minute and detailed.
Yeah, the miniatures are just so detailed, and the kind of the faces on these people, they look kind of high-minded and cultured. Yeah,
they do.
So that's all indications, and even that bird, you have to wonder if that was sort of maybe somehow related to the Fandors, the legends of the Fandors, perhaps. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, if that's how. The car that pulled up to start the civilization was the Fandor.
Yeah,
it seems
right.
that
something
might
like
be
that.
worth remembering.
And oral tradition is just a phenomenal thing. That memories can be maintained over thousands of years of ancient happenings.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I'll go on to the next slide. So this slide has a couple of just comments I've found looking online to see what's going on with those architectural digs and what the current state of understanding is about this region. And this first quote says that the discoveries of settlements of early prehistoric civilizations along the northern foothills of the Kopet Dag Mountains is rewriting history books. this vast archipelago of settlements stretches across 6,000 square kilometers. So minds are being blown by the discoveries that are being made of this prehistoric civilization that nobody even knew about. It's a lot of the references to it refer to it as a lost civilization.
Right,
everybody loves the mystery of that kind of thing. So this is a real example of that. And most of what they're finding is downstream from what that was developed, maybe 30,000 years ago.
From
but
Adamson,
it flowed out over that whole region. So here they say by 3000 BC, the people of the Kopet Dog had organized into walled towns. They used carts drawn by domesticated animals, meaning they had the wheel, right? Many Soviet and Western archaeologists suspect that the Oxus civilization, which is what they're calling this, at least in Margiana, the region in Turkestan and Uzbekistan, evolved from this Kopet Dog culture. So this is kind of the theory. They're starting to figure out that what they're finding and what they call the Oxus civilization had an earlier origin in the Kopet Dog culture, which kind of parallels what we're learning from the Urantia book.
Yeah, and let me show you just on the map really quick. So what they're talking about here is, here's Turkmenistan, where the cursor is, right here. And then up just a little bit north is Uzbekistan.
Mm-hmm.
And this is all that region where the Oxus people were.
Right. Yeah.
So we're in this whole region over here.
That's also referred to as the
BMAC.
BMAC civilization. Yeah. So the BMAC civilization and the Oxus civilizations are refer to the same thing. And these have just been discovered, since the 1960s and 70s. So BMAC is Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. It's a long, complicated name.
And there's this excavation there too.
Yeah, but there's excavations throughout that whole region.
Yeah.
So this next slide is kind of fun. This is a site that's been excavated. It's actually in northern Turkestan, closer to Uzbekistan. But it shows a very sophisticated circular design of architecture.
Yeah.
That's pretty striking and remarkable, I think. I mean, who knows what this actually looked like when it was, in full functional status. But it's a remarkable design, I think. Whenever I see monumental circular design, I always think this is probably a pretty high culture, because rectangles are a lot easier to build. So anyway, so that kind of inspired, if you want to go to the next slide, this is kind of a mid-journey conception of what the Adamsonite center might have looked like in the Kopet Dog.
It looks close to that architectural finding.
Yeah, I know. That's what struck me about it. And you can tell it's on a highland. So it sort of matches what it says about their highland location. And off in the distance there, you can almost see the Caspian Sea. So that kind of fits with what we've been told about the location of this center of civilization that was established by Adamson and Ratta, over the period of their lives and then thousands of years following that.
Yeah.
So just to give a little visual, picture for the mind, to get a sense of what it might have looked like. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And here I'm just kind of giving a couple of examples of the discoveries and contributions that took place in this region where the Adamsonites had set up their headquarters. The first of these is very significant. They say that the mixing of copper and tin to make bronze was made by one of the Adamsonites of Turkestan, and the Kopet Dog is in Turkestan, whose highland copper mine happened to be located alongside a tin deposit. So, they talk about Bronze Age cultures, how significant that is. It's like this became a whole sort of widespread identifier of a level of cultural civilization. It was identified with the use of bronze, right? So here we have the discovery of bronze by the Adamsonites in their highland location. So that must have spread quickly to many other people.
Oh, yeah.
And then they go on to say that the so-called Aryan mother tongue was in process of formation in the highlands of Turkestan in this same region. It was a blend of the Andonic dialect, which is earlier, and there were Andonic settlements in that region, of that region with the language of the Adamsonites and later Andites. So maybe in another show we'll get into more detail about the Andites, but there were these three different groups, three different populations that were mixing in that region, and they say that many modern languages are derived from this early speech of these Central Asian tribes. This ancient language gave the Occidental tongues all of that similarity, which is called Aryan.
Yeah, it makes me think of what we would call Proto-Indo-European.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So the Adamsonites had a role in this evolution of language that we've all inherited to this day.
Yeah, and you'll see it. I mean,
yeah,
that's why it's interesting if you start looking into Indo-European history, you'll start to see some Adamsonite and Andite influences and how we've inherited a lot of this stuff.
Right.
But we'll get into more specific details of
this next slide is going to take us into that a little bit.
Sure.
So they say that there successively arose at various periods 4 diverse cultures, respectively fostered by 4 different groups of Adamson's descendants. So the descendants of Adamson and Ratta created these 4 different groups, their offspring, over many, many years. It was the second of these groups which migrated westward to Greece and the islands of the Mediterranean. The residue of Adamson's descendants, meaning the other ones, migrated north and west to enter Europe with the blended stock of the last Andite wave coming out of Mesopotamia, and they were also numbered among the Andite Aryan invaders of India. So we have the legacy of Adamson and Ratta going into Greece, into Europe, and into India. So this next slide is kind of fun. It just kind of gives a visualization of those 3 cultures and how they, in some ways, preserved this idea of a king and a queen. I mean, it was really only in Europe. I mean, royalty was everywhere. You often have kings. But the idea of having a king and a queen is kind of unique to Europe. But then we can also see it in India, with the legends around Krishna, and then, of course, in Greece with all their pantheon of gods and goddesses. So all of this is kind of a downstream cultural influence that can be traced back to Adamson and Ratta.
Yeah, and figures actually show up. I mean, look at in the middle there, India, where you have a violet character over there, and Krishna's partner there, his name is Radha. Rahda. And here Krishna usually flies on a bird. He's standing on a flying bird, just like Adamson used to go find Ratta, right?
Yeah, so there you have it.
And you can look in Greece and the pantheon of the Olympian gods and the Titans and stuff. I mean, it's all in there. It's very interesting stuff.
Right. So we can go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So these next couple slides are going to be about Greece, because this is super important, I think, and extraordinary, and to see and understand. They say that almost 2,000 years after the settlement of Crete, so now we're coming a little closer to present day. So this is about 10,000 BC. Crete was settled by a group of Andites in the 12,000 BC. So around 10,000 BC, a group of the tall descendants of Adamson made their way over the northern islands to Greece, coming almost directly from their highland home north of Mesopotamia. So they're referring to the Kopet Dog there. These progenitors of the Greeks were led westward by Sato, a direct descendant of Adamson and Ratta. The group, which finally settled in Greece, consisted of 375 of the selected and superior people, comprising the end of the second civilization of the Adamsonites. These later sons of Adamson were of a high intellectual order and physically regarded the most beautiful of men and women since the days of the first Eden. So, keeping in mind that the whole mission of Adam and Eve was to provide racial uplift by intermating with the civilizations and races of this planet. So this group of 375 direct line offspring of Adamson and Ratta preserved their lineage over this whole long period and gifted themselves, you might say, to Greece. They decided, okay, this is where we want to plant ourselves, you might say. And there were only 375 of them, but they were of this superior type. And they provided the kind of the inspiration for then what later blossomed as Greek civilization, Greek culture. Let me go on to the next slide, where they say that practically all of the art and science of the Aegean world was derived from Mesopotamia. So that's what we're more familiar with. But then they say, except for the culture of the Adamsonite forerunners of the Greeks. All the art and genius of these latter people is a direct legacy of the posterity of Adamson, the first son of Adam and Eve, and his extraordinary second wife, a daughter descended in an unbroken line from the pure Nodite staff of Prince Caligastia. No wonder the Greeks had mythological traditions that they were directly descended from gods and superhuman beings, which is actually, there's truth in that.
Yeah, it actually is. And if I could just show you the map one more time, that's what was taking me a little while before. Sorry, I didn't get to it right away. But I just want to zoom in on the Adamsonite headquarters here where we are in Turkmenistan.
Uh-huh.
And so Sato just made this beeline across all the way west, all the way across the islands into northern Greece, and eventually mixed with the people who were in Crete, south. And this is where you get the Greeks.
Yeah.
And so these people in Crete, they were of a pretty cool lineage,
they were
as well.
Uh-huh.
And so then mixing with the Adamsonites, you get quite a remarkable group of people.
Yeah. But the fact that they just took a beeline and went directly, they were on a mission, in other words.
As you see on that map, it was a straight line right there.
They didn't just wander over there and stumble into Greece. You know, they were on a mission, and they went directly there and bestowed themselves upon the people they found, which is pretty remarkable.
Okay, some more about
so
the
going
Greeks.
on, here's just the end, kind of the end of that story. So they say the ancient Greeks, having preserved the traditions of Adamson's teachings, so these are a couple of the accomplishments, were among the first to recognize that all disease is the result of natural causes. So that understanding goes all the way back to Adamson, which goes back to Adam and Eve, because they were very understanding.
And remember, we were talking about the body, mind, spirit that they were emphasizing there.
Right.
This way of living.
Right. So the ancient Greeks preserved these traditions of Adamson's teachings and were the first to really grasp the truth of that. Because before that, it was all bound up in superstition and other kinds of,
This is science. This is
the beginning of science.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Good way of putting it. So then they say the Greeks were not only great teachers and artists, they were also the world's greatest traders and colonizers. They succeeded in planting so many outposts of culture to the west of Greece that a great many of the advances in early Greek civilization persisted in the later peoples of southern Europe, which would obviously include the Romans.
Right.
So they're pretty much saying that the Romans, as we all know, borrowed a lot from Greek culture.
Oh, yeah.
So, and that traces back to Adamson and this group of Adamsonites that came down into Greece. So that's interesting to see the cultural lineage.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can't help but have some of my own. Maybe Greek. It's a nice group to be a part of.
Absolutely.
Just the blend of the athleticism and the poetry, philosophy, art, architecture. I mean, there's just so much
beauty, the sense of beauty, use of the golden mean and their proportions.
Telling me beautiful, Chuck. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But no, my mother is beautiful. I'm just something else. But
no, it's really, I mean,
when we look about Western civilization,
right, exactly.
And I think this is really important when you look at these battles of migration throughout history. Even when we look at World War II and communism coming in through across Western civilization, right?
Yeah.
is that this is what was established there.
Uh-huh.
And then eventually then these Adamsonite descendants even became part of the Salem missionary crew.
Yeah.
Right? So they were part of the Melchizedek teachers who were going out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so these were...
Yeah, they were up around Lake Van.
Yeah. So this lineage of loyalty to the mission, in spite of all the rebellion and default that's out there, Van and Amadon held that. Adamson and Ratta went up there and held that.
Right.
And then Melchizedek pops up and their descendants come in and hold that.
Right.
And displace it throughout the whole world, as did the Greeks and other people who had the same inheritance.
Right. So there's a legacy of loyalty to the mission.
Yeah.
As you're saying, to uphold the standards of a high culture and civilization.
Yeah. It's something about in the Greek culture of that there is an underlying honor and set of principles of nobility that are always there, no matter what region you are in Greece.
Right.
It's always there. And so you can't help but think that's just baked in, you know?
Right. Yeah. It's very deep, very deep.
Mm-hmm.
And in another podcast, we'll get into other regions, you know, where the Andites, and we'll explain more about that, brought their influence, which includes some in China, some in India, some in Europe, and even all the way across to South America. That's a crazy story.
Yeah.
So that was the other big branch, and that came out of the Second Garden, were the Andites.
Right.
But the Adamsonites are sort of given less attention, but they're super important.
Yeah, let me go back to the map just one more time here.
Okay.
And here's that beeline that they made from Turkmenistan to Greece. But I think it's important that we look at, okay, so this is what we're talking about, the second Eden and Adamson headquarters. So between these two is basically the racial and cultural upliftment of the planet.
Uh-huh.
So when we talk about Andites and we talk about Adamsonites, this is where they're coming from. And you can look at it throughout history where they talk about how most of our early inheritance of modern man come from Mesopotamia. Mm-hmm. Even up into Europe. It goes into Europe. It goes into China, like we're talking about, all over.
Into Egypt, of course.
Into Egypt. And we'll get into this. I mean, with some of the Andite shows, we'll show some of the technology that they used.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what keeps them apart from everybody else.
Yeah. And the monolithic architecture and construction that we see sprinkled all over the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where that comes from. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so just to close this off, there's this interesting comment in the Urantia book about what was intended that never got to be fully realized. But I'll just read this and you'll see what I mean. They say that the life carriers, who are the order of being who are responsible for planning life, how it unfolds on this world, the life carriers had planned a new type of mortal, embracing the union of the conjoined offspring of the prince's staff, going back to Caligastia, with the first generation offspring of Adam and Eve. They had thus projected a plan envisioning a new order of planetary creatures whom they hoped would become the teacher rulers of human society. Such beings were designed for social sovereignty, not civil sovereignty. But since this project almost completely miscarried, we shall never know what an aristocracy of benign leadership and matchless culture Urantia was thus deprived of. So when they say it almost completely miscarried, the exception there is this mating of Adamson and Ratta, because Adamson was first generation offspring of Adam and Eve, and Ratta was a pure line nodite from the prince's staff. So in the two of them, more or less, they fulfilled this promise or this possibility. I mean, there are other aspects where they didn't quite, anyway, it gets complicated. But in any case, the point here is that they're a demonstration of what might have been on a planetary scale.
There's a little microcosm of what happened. Yeah. If you look at the secondary midwares that we were talking about, and you start to look at some of the Greek pantheon and the interplay between those personalities, the gods and the heroes and the demigods, you'll start to see the line of secondary midwares, Andites and Adamsonites, and humans who have been influenced by these unseen beings, and whether they're giving fortune or unfortune, is what in history. There's also this unique period of everything before Jesus, before Pentecost, is when these midwares were able to behave in this way. And we can get into that in future shows, but this is why it's such a unique opportunity. Everything before Pentecost was like a different world.
Yeah.
And then after Jesus came, all the oracles went silent and other things happened. So
yeah, we're in a different kind of stage of things. But what they're talking about here is all of the prince's staff intermarrying with many, many first generation offspring of Adam and Eve.
Should have happened.
That's what they planned for, and that's
Right.
what they hoped for. And what that would have produced, is kind of beyond our imagining. But that's what they're pointing to here. So what we have instead is one offspring from the prince's staff with one offspring from Adam and Eve who did mate, and their progenitors, produced everything we've been talking about. So as powerful as that is, we can get a sense of what might have been.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
Welcome to this planet.
Yeah, right. A lot of things have gone wrong.
Yeah.
There's a lot of might have been, would have been, could have been.
Yeah. Of what could have been.
Many face palms of disappointment.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Chuck, man. Great work
Yeah.
on this one. I know everyone at home, this took a little while because there was a lot of content to sift through.
I know. It's a lot to try to find coherence here. And I learned a lot preparing this, and there's still a lot more to dig out. So forgive me if I made mistakes along the way, but I think it's a much better understanding than I had before I started in on this.
Yeah, no, man, I'm proud of you. I thought you did a great job. And this is just unfolding. So you're just kind of learning.
This is just one thread, one story that runs through the civilization of this planet.
Yeah.
So important.
All right. Well, we'll get to more in the future. If you got any suggestions or comments, leave them in the comments. And maybe we'll get into secondary midwares next. I know we need to get to the beginning of Dalmatia and kind of unfold from that. Make things a lot more clear for everyone.
Right. So we'll pick up those threads.
All right. Well, thanks everyone at home. Thanks, Chuck, again.
Thanks for your patience. Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
Mm-hmm.